In my last video, I quickly surveyed the thrill of the chase, noting structural elements and themes, trying to make sense of the twists and turns of this unique memoir. There are lots of places where the author made unusual choices. And at the end of my video, I said that one chapter stands out as the most unusual of all, the introduction. I'm calling important literature the introduction, even though it doesn't call itself that. It's the first chapter with a title outside of the preface, but it doesn't have the postmark that almost all the other chapters have. And while the next chapter starts with a very young Forrest Fenn, a typical first chapter, important literature tells the story, ostensibly, about how he got started writing, the kind of thing you would do in an introduction. And my sense is that it was written after he'd completed the rest of the memoir, which is customary for an introduction. But it's difficult to figure out what he's doing in these early sections, particularly on pages 6 to 7, which are between the preface and important literature. So to begin, let's get an overview of these three sections: the preface, important literature, and the 2 pages in between. Let's start by asking, what is this middle section? Is it a continuation of the preface? Or is it a nameless chapter, in which case important literature is chapter 2? Reasons to take it as a continuation of the preface include the tone and subject matter, and the fact that every chapter in the book has a name except this one. On the other hand, there's a dedication page between it and the preface. This is a head-scratcher. To be safe for now, we can just call it pages 6 to 7. But let's examine internal evidence to see if we can figure out what we've got here. First, the preface. In 2006, the story broke that James Frey's A Million Little Pieces wasn't 100% autobiographical. He had mixed personal history and unreliable memory in a way that countless authors had done before, but there was something about the way it was packaged and sold, at a time when the public was grappling with memoir as a distinct literary genre. This is the same year Forrest published My War for Me online and was starting to work on his own stories. Forrest's preface came out of this zeitgeist, and it addressed these issues head-on. As something of an aside, here's James Frey talking about that dust-up, and I'm going to play an extended portion of this. Tell me if you don't hear the maverick spirit of Forrest Fenn in Frey's recounting of his ordeal.
I didn't write that book as a memoir. I've never thought of it as a memoir. We didn't submit it to publishers as memoirs, even though it was published as one. When the controversy blew up and, I was sort of written off by the publishing business and by the literary community, instead of being upset about it, I was kind of excited. I was like, I had to work within your system. I wrote a book that wasn't what it was published as. I always knew I wasn't born to work in that system, and I won't ever do it again. From that point forward, I was free. I got kicked out of a club I didn't want to be a part of, and it was awesome. Since then, I've literally done what I want. I call it what I want. I don't say I write fact or fiction. I don't write novels or memoirs or, narrative nonfiction. I just write books. I tell stories. The expectations and rules and conventions of the literary community or the publishing community or society in general mean absolutely nothing to me. What means something to me is telling a story in the way I think is the right way to do it. And if I need to use factual elements or fictional elements or things that live in the gray area between, if I have to use grammar of my own invention, if I have to lay the pages out, the Million Little Pieces controversy really freed me to be as radical as I want, to break every rule I want, and to not have to care what other people thought. It was great.
So back to the preface. Forrest's very first sentence as a memoirist addresses remembered truth versus fact, and what the role of a storyteller is. His second paragraph about killing meadowlarks for dinner shoos away the politically correct crowd who can't see his stories in their historical context. And he finishes with a statement about using words that aren't in the dictionary. It's basically a 3-pronged disclaimer. That's the preface, a disclaimer about things that might offend. Next, we have pages 6 to 7. What is this section about? It's about growing old, Eric Sloane, and fatherly wisdom. Sloane, born in 1905, was 25 years Forrest's senior. You get the sense that Forrest is comforted somewhat, knowing that his dear friend has gone before him on this path to eternity. He likes the way Eric got old. Eric is his exemplar. Eric and Forrest's father died within a year of each other, and this short chapter ends with a couple of anecdotes that contain fatherly advice. So, we've transitioned from a preface involving disclaimers to a chapter that puts yourself inside the mind of someone who is not exactly at the finish line of life, but who knows it's not too far off. He says he thinks about regrets, and he's thinking here about loved ones he's lost. So now let's talk about important literature, which, as I've already mentioned, I think belongs lumped together with this other preliminary material, rather than the first chapter of the body of this book. Now, before I jump in, by way of introduction to this introduction, let's recall who Forrest Fenn was in 2010 when he wrote this book. He was a decorated fighter pilot, ranked a major, who had earned the Silver Star and had served as an instructor for several years on Luke Air Force Base in Phoenix. A leader in a culture where elbows are thrown and the strong rise to the top. He was a world traveler, having spent significant time in Asia, Europe, Africa, and several locations in the U.S. He was a highly successful art dealer who had helped elevate Western art in the 70s and 80s. In 1986, Fenn Galleries, the largest in Santa Fe, was grossing $6 million annually. That's $14 million in today's dollars. And his inventory was valued at about $20 million, which is $50 million today. He was recognized as an authority in his field. For example, when the National Cowboy Hall of Fame in Oklahoma City wanted their 200-plus works appraised in 1982, they hired two people from the two biggest art centers in the United States, Rudolph Wunderlich, former president of Kennedy Galleries in New York City, and Forrest Fenn from Santa Fe. They appraised the collection, by the way, at roughly $130 million. He had been written about in numerous national publications, including National Geographic, the New York Times, People magazine, and the Washington Post. He himself was a published author of 8 books, most of them scientific and scholarly in nature. He was a researcher and field supervisor of the archaeological site at San Lazaro. People like to play up the conflicts he had, but he worked with and alongside colleagues for over a decade, calling in others when particular expertise was needed, as they did with the wooden effigy discovered in room 26 in '94. They called Dr. Eric Blinman from the New Mexico Office of Archaeological Studies. He was a collector of the first order, with a store of arrowheads called the Fenn Cache that rivaled any other collection outside of a museum. He had a tremendous passion for history. He was a collector of rare and significant books, including many first editions, and was amassing an outstanding personal library. He was on a first-name basis with Fred Rosenstock, for example, a well-known bookseller and collector out of Denver. He was on the board of trustees for the Buffalo Bill Center for the West for over a decade. In his home, he was surrounded by original artwork by Modigliani and original bronzes by Remington and Rodin, as well as his outstanding collections. His friends included world-renowned artists, best-selling authors, scholars, Academy Award-winning actors. He frequently hosted world leaders, ambassadors, senators, and presidents. So why, I ask you, why open your memoir with an introduction that makes you seem illiterate and unsophisticated? When you've hosted heads of state, why pretend that you're crippled by self-consciousness? And because of a book given to you 70 years ago? Why say you can't start writing a book when you've already written 8? Why describe yourself as having a fragile ego when you've snubbed your nose at academia and fought the FBI in court? You're telling me you pulled 5 Gs in an F-100 and you're frightened by a teenager at Borders? You may say, don't you get it? Forrest doesn't go for that highfalutin nonsense. And you're right, he's down to earth. He doesn't stand on ceremony. He doesn't put on airs, and he dislikes people who do. He's an autodidact, but he's not anti-intellectual, which is an element of this introduction. Forrest is well educated. He just did his learning outside the classroom, through experience, apprenticeships, and books. He's not anti-literature, which also seems to be the point of this introduction. Rather, he reveres books. As far as I can tell, he despises the smugness of the ivory tower, the self-importance, the snobbery. But he loves knowledge. He loves science and archaeology and history. He loves books. He's not some yokel who just fell off the turnip truck. He's a highly intelligent, curious, successful person who likes to surround himself with highly intelligent, curious, successful people. Forrest is the opposite of dumb, so in this introduction, why play dumb? When you first encounter this introduction, you have to be disappointed and confused because rather than encounter the author in the guise of war hero, shrewd businessman, kindly cowboy poet, astute collector and archaeologist, seasoned author, wise grandfather, etc., it sounds like a surly 13-year-old. To show you the stark contrast in writing style, I could point you to his article in the Ohio Archaeologist. I could point you to his books on native culture. But instead, all you have to do is read the rest of the memoir. The rest of the memoir doesn't sound like this introduction. And so I have a working theory. And it's this. I think the introduction is a put-on. It's a lark. And I think he wrote it with a nod to the one piece of important literature that he dug out of the trash. And he does it so obviously, the only thing he didn't do is call Hemingway a phony. He said that Salinger had written his story, or at least part of his own story. So, Forrest turns that around and he lets Holden Caulfield do a guest spot in the introduction. As far as voice or tone, The Catcher in the Rye is characterized by a number of distinctive traits. Use of the vernacular, filler phrases, metanoia, which is backtracking or self-correction, self-consciousness, over-explaining one's own thought process, frankness, hyperbole, generalization, a cynical, surly tone, and callowness. Holden Caulfield is naive, but he doesn't know just how much. And they're all present in important literature. Tell me you don't hear Holden Caulfield in these. She didn't even say goodbye or anything. Anyway, when she finished sipping, he even had a sister like mine, the guy in the story, I mean, not JD. So now I'm holding copies of these books and standing right in the middle of the entire store with people all around. I didn't dare look to see who was staring. I thought it was rude of them to read with no thought of buying or anything. The loudmouth checkout guy thought what he'd done was real clever. He said in a loud voice, "Catcher in the Rye, that idiot." So now everyone in the whole dumb store started staring at me and not at him. I had to stand in the checkout line behind a bunch of middle-aged looking people. Most of them were women because I suppose all the middle-aged looking guys were at work someplace. She regaled me with the reasons why we are so lucky to have great books in our lives. He seemed like my kind of guy, but I couldn't figure out how he could be such an important writer when I'd never even heard of him. Compare important literature to what appears immediately after. This is not the insult-hurling, insecure, petty, naive young man we just heard from, who makes fun of middle-aged people. What 80-year-old makes fun of middle-aged people? No, Forrest Fenn, wise elder statesman, thoughtful poet, contemplating eternity, sits by a fire and meditates. The voice immediately distinguishes itself. Not a day passes that I don't question myself about what lies just ahead. Now, near the end of my 79th year, each day tests me. I know that before too long I'll make my last flight to where even memory itself will never have been. Sooner or later each of us will be nothing but the leftovers of history or an asterisk in a book that was never written. So now I sit here past midnight, beside my juniper fire, reflecting back to the year when my awareness took its first few steps. Just imagine how this page would read if the persona from important literature had written it. Now, an echo of that disaffected persona is still felt somewhat in the early chapters, but a pleasantness creeps in. He admits to secretly loving Miss Ford. Before long, all the cynicism of the introduction fades, and there's a sweetness that imbues the vignettes. By the time you get to My Spanish Toy Factory, he allows himself to be downright nostalgic. Me in the Middle, Surviving Myself, and Gypsy Magic are all written with a kind of charming, wistful, romantic eye for detail. I did a little survey of these early sections and compared them to chapters 5 and 7, looking in particular for the characteristics of Catcher in the Rye. Granted, it's a little subjective, but I tried to let the evidence lead me. This really shows you how unique, how strange, important literature is. But if I'm right, it makes sense, because Forrest was channeling Salinger as Holden Caulfield. Notice how use of the vernacular and filler phrases are ubiquitous, even after he's dropped the persona. That's just how Forrest writes. But the other stuff is an affectation. So why? Why let Holden Caulfield write your introduction? I suppose we have to consider that he might have done it unconsciously. But it's so over the top. Maybe he needed a way in. It can be very difficult to write, and self-doubt can be paralyzing. So maybe a writer friend suggested he read Salinger and just let the words fly, like you see on the pages of Catcher in the Rye. Don't worry about what it will sound like, just write. Maybe the persona was like a supportive device or a booster rocket to get started, but he dropped it after a bit. But this would mean he wrote it first, would it not? I made the assumption that he wrote it later. Now I'm not sure. Maybe it crept into early chapters, and he saw it later and decided to do full-on imitation in this introduction. Or he wrote most of this introduction first as an exercise, and he retained it temporarily. Is he setting himself up as an unreliable narrator? That doesn't make sense. He wants us to trust him. He drops the persona. The tone begins to change once we're out of the introduction. Someone might suggest that he was trying to mimic his own psychological development with an evolving POV. But in the introduction? When he's 79? That would make sense in the early chapters of the body of the memoir, and actually does a little of that, but not here. Or maybe it's a test. Maybe he's put up a roadblock here to see if you can get past it. A barrier to entry. Are you going to think Forrest is the narrator of this introduction? Will you dismiss him because of it? Or will you get it? Will you be in on the joke that this is not Forrest, but rather sullen and sophomoric Holden Caulfield? I tend to think it's one or both of these. As he was stretching his wings and warming up to write, I think he may have actually dipped into these three classics as he was trying to find his voice, and he decided that Salinger held the key. I don't believe he had never heard of Salinger, or that he was dumbfounded that a book could be printed in paperback. I don't think he was scared by the staff at Borders, and I don't think he goes around mentally insulting practically everyone he encounters. I don't think he hoped and prayed that he could one day write a book, because of course he had written books. I'm not sure why he did what he did in this section, but I know what he did. He conjured up Salinger. As to how we view these sections and what place they have in the book, I'm a little agnostic. I lean toward pages 6 to 7 being a continuation of the preface, and important literature is an introduction, a unique, head-scratching introduction for a one-of-a-kind memoir with a giant puzzle near the end, one that we're all still trying to figure out. It seems fitting. Which makes me wonder, if Forrest was having this much fun, being this mischievous in his introduction, could this be one of the main places, perhaps the main place, where he put hints? Now that's a head-scratcher.